Hello and welcome to the Stacking Dingers Show, your home for all things Underdog, Major League Baseball. You can visit our Substack at stackingdingers.com for the show, rankings, and all of our written content. I'm Matthew, aka Sheep, aka Dark Sheep, and you can find me on X at D4RKSH33P underscore. And you can check out my draft streams at the Sheep Seats over on YouTube. We do have a few guests or a couple co-hosts tonight. We have Chris, the man of the hour tonight, who has cooked up a bunch of great data visualizations based on 2023 data that we'll be diving into. You can check him out on X at B3ISBOL. And the third wheel tonight is Brendan at Too Much Tuma on the X. He is the head of MLB info at Underdog Fantasy, and his Substack is at brendantuma.substack.com. If you are brand new to Underdog Baseball, this is not the episode for you. You'll come back here in a little bit, but go back one more episode behind to the Stacking Dingers episode 7 show, which is I was joined by Nez, and we really walked through the basics of Underdog baseball scoring format, contest selection, and all that kind of stuff. So just want to highly recommend that if you're tuning into this one first. Might not be the greatest place to start, and then we have other shows with some more other strategy discussions. But tonight we are going to start with Chris. You want to just start? Where are we starting here? I guess.
So, I guess big picture, we get great data. We've gotten the Dingers data from last year. We have the year before that. And we last year had a bigger contest. We're able to try and do a lot more with it. I think going into last year, we had a very kind of base understanding of this is, how many pitchers, how many infielders, how many outfielders. Like it was kind of the very high level, some structure things, some late round, early round things. That was kind of where we were able to kind of cap our work at. And this year we got everything a lot sooner. So we got this data like in November, December, like we got kind of a 2-3 month head start on what we usually got. So that has allowed me some time to crack into it. And the number one goal that I had with looking at this stuff, and I've been saying this now for a couple months, was I wanted to really crack into what makes this weekly game tick, because it's a season-long game, but with week-long scoring periods, and we look at everything through like a seasonal lens up to this point. So I really wanted to try and narrow it down and figure out some stuff that we can talk about to shift our thinking from fully season long to a week by week basis was like the big picture goal. And we've gotten there a couple different ways that we're going to talk about tonight that are very, very high level, like big picture stuff. And then as we go kind of through the rest of the off season into the start of, or I guess the start of the season, we're going to start narrowing that in. So we're going to move away from what are these big picture strategies and big picture ideas, and more on how can we use this info to like make our specific selections and think about players differently as well. Like we're shifting kind of the lens, and that's like the entire goal of today, is to like get everyone comfortable with thinking weekly, not seasonally, and moving us kind of in that direction.
Yeah. So first, we are starting with a more of a season long graph here. This is specifically about stacking hitters together. Inspiration, for the name of this whole endeavor is sort of came with everybody's obsession with discussing stacks and playing the dinger and all that. And so this is a complex graph, but the first thing we need to do is define what you are talking about when you talk about a stacked hitter.
So the concept of stacking is like one of the key core things in NFL best ball for sure. Like we kind of just know that that is good at this point, and we're all kind of playing towards that end game. Baseball is a lot more gray area because your week isn't one game, it's multiple games. So how does that kind of, diffuse the impact of stacking that you compound? We know that in daily stuff, very beneficial to be stacking. From this point of view, the way we're defining this total number of stacked hitters is across your 12, 13, 14 hitters, however many you have, how many of them did you draft with a teammate? So, for example, if you have 3 Yankees, 3 Red Sox, 3 Rays, 3, 3, and 3, you have 9 total hitters in stacks. So you're going to fall into that fourth bucket, the like 8 to 9 hitter bucket. I wanted to look at it this way first, just to get the like out of your whole team, how many guys are you pairing? How many guys are you kind of putting in this stacked versus non-stacked bucket? And then we can kind of narrow it down after. But I think this is like the base. This is what we're going to look at here to start with.
Yeah. So the bar graph sort of in the background is the buckets, or I guess bins, that you separated them into. So 0 stacked hitters, 2 to 3, 4 to 5, and so on. So that's where it's from multiple teams. So Brendan, as we can see, the field is over half the field is in that middle zone with the 4 to 5 hitters or the 6 to 7 hitters. Do you think that comes naturally, or do you think that's driven by daily, or what do you think that's driven by?
It's funny because we talk about all the time, just trying to like grow this game. And one of the first questions that I get from people is, what about stacking, and it's something that last year I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the idea was, stacking is, probably good, but it's way too small a sample to know anything. And, it makes sense that it should be good, but like you said, it's a weekly game and everything. And the fact that we didn't know, we just didn't want to be telling people like, yeah, you should stack, even if it did make sense. Um, so yeah,
I
I'm sorry, Matt. I forgot your original question for a sec, but I'm still like reacting to all these charts in real time here, and I just think like that AROE line, like just going up and up, the more you stack is, that's really eye opening to me.
Yeah. So the question was, where do you think the stacking, 4 to 5 hitters, 6 to 7 hitters came from? Was that just a natural occurrence, or yeah, I guess something from other sports like football, or
Yeah, Chris mentioned football as an inspiration for it. I also think there's a lot of people who play MLB DFS who have started drafting on Underdog, and with DFS especially, it's not just about stacking the team. It's about, stacking the lineup spots. It doesn't do you a ton of good if you have like the 1 hitter, the 5 hitter, the 7 hitter, the 9 hitter. But if you have like, 2, 3, 4 or 2, 3, 5, that makes a big difference. So yeah, I definitely think some of them happen naturally. And you guys are more in, the streets of Discord of, talking with people every day about other people drafting. But I do remember people being into like the Braves last year and trying to get multiple Braves. And, so that was obviously a huge hit, but there was chatter about it last year for sure.
Yeah, great segue, because the big caveats here with all of this kind of analysis we're talking about today, this stacking stuff is player and lineup spot agnostic. So what that means is we are simply looking at, are you a hitter from the same MLB team? That's it. That's where we've drawn kind of the line. We're not analyzing kind of anything beyond that. This is like the most base kind of correlation that you could expect. Do you play for the same team? Are you both hitters? Yes, stacked. No, not stacked. So like,
I think that's why, again, like bringing it back to this AROE line, like that's why that line is so surprising to me, because this isn't, oh, you stacked a good offense and it was the top 3 hitters in the lineup. Like, and if those were the parameters and I saw this line, I would be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. But the fact that it's so broad and we're still seeing success with it, and that's what's really, I think, like the story from this first chart.
so before we continue on, we should, Chris, why don't you talk about these lines in the AROE, SROE, FROE, BBCROE, and no, I'm kidding on that last one. But what are those representing?
So most of these graphs are very similar and they have kind of a similar structure. Bars are going to indicate your percentage of teams, like Matt said. It's going to be the decision you made on draft day. How many hitters did you take from these teams? What's very interesting about this graph is that those bars are very like bell curved and very spread nicely and evenly. We've seen with the roster construction stuff before that people have started to congregate on 6 or 7 pitchers. People have started to congregate on 6 or 7 infielders, 6 or 7 outfielders. Here, one of the most interesting things to me is I don't think the field really had any idea last year, like what they really wanted to do with this. And that's how you're getting this big spread. Like we have the same number of people only stacking 2 to 3 hitters as we do 8 to 9. That is a wild spread in like the build of your team. And it's just kind of all the way from start to finish. I think people have kind of figured that 0 is bad, but everything else is like within the realm of possibility. So those are your bars. Your bars are what happened on draft day. Your lines are going to be how did that drafted team perform throughout the year. The way we've normalized this so that it's just a simple kind of plus or minus to 0 is we looked at what's the expected advance rate for a random team. So last year, your first round pod, there were 12 teams in your draft. Only 2 of those teams made it on to the next round. If you do 2 over 12, you get 16.67%. So 16.67 is our new 0 for the AROE, which is advance rate over expectation. Every bucket, every subset of the population that had an advance rate among those teams that was higher than 16.67 is going to get a positive AROE, meaning that subset of teams advanced to the second round more often than you would expect from a random group of teams or from the whole population. Same thing goes for SROE and FROE. Those two respectively are semis rate over expectation and finals rate over expectation. The expected percentage for both of those is a lot lower because you're carrying kind of this percentage through 1 round, 2 rounds, 3 rounds. So you're basically multiplying out, the fraction 2 out of 12 times 2 out of 12 times, I think it was 1 out of 6, 2 out of 10, something like that. So you carry those forward. And that's why in all of these graphs, you're going to see AROE is kind of the biggest, highest and the lowest because you're working with a bigger number to start with, where FROE is going to be very kind of tightly correlated to 0. It's going to be very close to that line because the expectation for making the finals is very, very low. Like there's not many teams that make the finals. It's very hard to do. And there's not a ton structurally that you can do to launch yourselves or could have done last year to launch yourselves into the finals. So that's why we're going to kind of get this common pattern of AROE having the biggest splits, S in the middle, F kind of tightly correlated to 0. Like Matt said, the first thing, and Brendan said too, the first thing that jumps off the page here is just how kind of beautifully linear this AROE line is. This shocked me, frankly, when I ran it for the first time and saw just what the numbers were going to be. It's very rare that I've gotten kind of stuff that's as clean as this, where it is basically saying the more total hitters you stacked, the more likely you were to advance from your pod, almost to a T. The one wrinkle here to note is that I've bucketed 2 and 3 together, 4 and 5 together, 6 and 7 together. The reason with that is that people most often take pairs of teammates. So the even number bars are a lot higher. So if I had left them all separate, we'd have a high number of people taking 2 and then a low 3 and then a high 4 and a low 5. And it just looks ugly and doesn't give us really any good results. So we have this nice kind of smooth bin. But yeah, the trend here that I got from this one is essentially stacking last year was helpful, and the more you did it, the better you did.
So the question I immediately have is, well, these numbers are small, despite being a linear thing. So like when I'm looking at this, the difference between negative 0.3 and plus 1.1% isn't really that huge. So I guess, can you speak to like the significance of this, or how much you think it actually is important?
Great point. The thing that I need everyone to pay attention to while we're looking at these graphs, before you ask me any questions about like, what's going on here, just look at the scales on the right-hand side. If you're, at home looking at this same thing, just pay attention to what those numbers are. This is between 2% and minus 2%. That's like a small range. It's not a ton. There's going to be some that are bigger and there's going to be some that are smaller. Like it's very, tight. The thing that we are just trying to do, that I've said before, and I will say again, is we are just trying to be directionally accurate. And I think here, the difference between the buckets is small. This is only one season. This is only one set of teams. This is only one tournament. But what we want to do is just try and think about what happened last year and how we can apply it to this year. And my kind of just overall takeaway, if you take away the specific percentages and think about the scale and be like, okay, I'm not making my decision in a draft based on I have 5. I need to get to 6. So I get to like plus 1.1. I'm just thinking more is better to a point. If you stack everyone, I think I ran out of space, but it kind of tails off at the end. But last year, very, very important. Last year, not this year. Descriptive, not predictive. More stacking was better for your team by a small amount. You're just trying to stack small edges on top of each other, and this is one way to do that.
I was just going to add in that I think there's 2 ways to think about stacking too, because again, if you come from like DFS, especially stacking both in baseball and football, like you can get like huge, tournament winning results. And when you think about baseball, it's the way underdog scoring works, it's a weekly game. And so there could be, 5, 6, 7 games. And it's hard to imagine, honestly, any lineup, even the Braves last year, just going so berserk over, 6 or 7 games that, it tips the scales that heavily. So what I would encourage people to think about with stacking is it doesn't always need to be that, 100th percentile outcome where your stack works on a weekly basis. It could just be that you have the 4 or 5 hitters for the Dodgers. The Dodgers are popular team to think about stacking this year for. So if you have Max Muncy and Teoscar Hernandez, they just help each other enough to where they make your lineup. And like you said, that's where you're kind of getting those edges over and over. It doesn't need to be the biggest, home run every week.
Exactly. Might be jumping the gun here, but Matt, can we flip to the wide view where it's all the teams and their result? It's a bunch of little bars. Yes, this. So the next most important caveat that we need to think about is that bar on the far left, the impact that Atlanta had on your team last year. They were like a smash beyond all measure in any way. They were a historically good lineup. What this is showing is, we were talking just before on the, how many did you stack? What was your percentage difference between 2 and minus 2%? So that was a very small range. This is the same analysis, but just broken out by team instead of by number of stacked players. So Atlanta last year, if you paired any two Braves hitters, Acuna, Albies, Murphy, Grissom, anybody, they all fall in that bucket. So there's your caveat number 1. That bucket was 18.5% advancing above expectation. So that, if you paired 2 Atlanta teammates, you were twice as likely to advance out of your pod compared to, a random set of things. The other thing to note here, we have a lot of tall, heavy bars on the left. Your Atlanta stack smashed, your Washington stack smashed, your Arizona stack smashed. Then it kind of drops off after the 5%ish, and we get to this middle ground of like Miami to Philly, where it's all between that kind of 2% plus minus range. On the negative end, you will see it doesn't get any worse than Houston at minus 5.4, despite them being the quote unquote worst stack for your team. If you stacked any two Astros, you were 5% less likely to advance.
Which I did a lot.
Yep, same. It explains a lot looking at this. I was light on the heavy end and heavy on the light end, so that didn't end well. Stacking Houston was 1/3 as hurtful as stacking Atlanta was good. So if you kind of hit the nut outcome, that was 3 times better for your team than having the quote unquote worst one. So I think stacking this, what this tells me, it raises your floor a tad. Like most of these bad, quote unquote bad stacks were just, marginally bad. And if you hit the Atlanta, you are so far ahead of the game.
Yeah. And, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Matt.
I was going to say, and you could probably even break that down more and just say, like, Acuna, like how much of that, just any pair Acuna and another Brave, like what that was. So,
very successful.
I was gonna add on to that, and with the other teams, because if you would have had me guess the second best team, I would have guessed Texas, just because that was a lineup that it felt like as a whole overperformed last year. That was kind of like a season long hit in terms of stacking. But then you pull this up and it's, it's Washington, Arizona. And I think, it's like you said, right now, like we're talking that it could be any two hitters, but in which that makes sense. That's what the first part of the analysis is. But I think even just looking at this, it's fair to start asking, well, why was that team a hit? And, for Washington, it was Lane Thomas. And it'd be interesting to know, how many of those were, Lane Thomas related. And for Arizona, it's Corbin Carroll. So I think that's just something else to keep in mind with these.
So this is season long. So this is going to be your this is your long-term view of what happened. I did this and didn't send it to Matt, which was on me, but I did a version that was the semis, only the semis. How well did you do in the semis round last year based on the team that you stacked? Despite Atlanta being like the overwhelmingly best team to have stacked during the regular season, they were like 8th, 9th, 10th for that 1-2 week period. So you can have the best outcome possible, and then people got wiped out by their like 1.5 cold weeks, and it was someone random. It might have been like Baltimore or Boston. Somebody went crazy in the semis.
I was gonna get
through the roof.
I was gonna guess Philly. Didn't Philly have that run with Trey Turner?
They did.
When he got really hot towards the end.
They were one of the big ones that flipped. But so you can chop it up as small as you want. This was just like the longest term view that we have.
Well, that's probably also another case for stacking is right, like you said, we're looking at like the regular season, the season long basis here. But if we know that stacking can on a weekly basis boost your scores, it's like the idea is like you're sneaking through a stack that wasn't a huge hit in the regular season, but because I got these 3 Pirates that not a lot of other people have, and the Pirates have a huge week, like that's where it can tilt in your favor as well.
Which is a great transition into the next graph, and that is what Chris kind of started off with the introduction, and that is now breaking down into weekly scoring and how stacking affects your weekly scoring. So I'll let you, I could stumble through it, but I'll let you, Chris, explain your methodology for how you determined this stuff.
So this is very important. Oh, froze and I'm back. Very important that like kind of we're all working off the same ideas here when we're talking about weekly, because this kind of idea is going to be the basis for the stuff we talk about today, the stuff we talk about down the road if we do other variations of this player specific stuff. What we've done is we've taken our last year's tournament, 55,000 teams drafted. We've already looked at them season long many times, many ways. That's one tournament's worth. Small sample, like very, it is helpful to describe what happened. What is it actually telling us about the future? We don't know. Don't know if this is helpful either. But what we've done is we've taken those 55,000 teams, and instead of doing one long tournament, we've cut it into 25 individual tournaments over the course of last year. So this is separate from the Underdog schedule. This is just weeks during last year's MLB season. So I just took, as many games as we could, and we treated each week like a mini tournament. So for that specific week, we calculated, what was the score for your roster and where did that rank among all 55,000 teams, like you would in a DFS tournament, essentially. How close did you get to the top? And we took that, we have our list from 1 to 55,000. And then based on the percentiles that I've included here, we determined a number of rounds advanced. So if you scored in the top 16.67% of teams, which is equivalent to our season-long advance rate. So if your team was in that top echelon, I gave you credit for advancing one round. If you were in the 97th percentile or higher, which is equivalent to making the semis in our season-long score, I gave you credit for advancing 2 rounds. So like advancing out of your pod and then winning the next week. And then I did 99.5 fifth percentile and up. If you got to that top 0.5% of all 55,000 teams, I credited you with making the finals, with advancing 3 times. So those were kind of the assumptions that we're working off of here. It's each week is its own tournament. Wherever you placed in the overall score that week, 1 to 55,000 determines how far you went. And then we've run it the same way. We've got our bars as the percentage of teams, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then we have our advance rate, our semis rate, and our finals rate. So the bars, you will notice if you are closely scrutinizing, they are different from the bars in the season-long graph. The percentages are slightly different, and they are shifted towards the left. They're shifted toward the 0 hitter end. Because what I did when I ran it this version is I considered the number of total stacked hitters that you had on your team. It could have been different every week depending on who you had healthy and who played. So for example, if you had, let's go back to that 3 + 3 + 3 stack of 9, Yankees, Red Sox, Rays, you get to June and Aaron Judge gets hurt. He's not playing for like 2 weeks in June. For those 2 weeks, I considered your team no longer to be 3 + 3 + 3, but I considered them to be 2 Yankees, 3 Red Sox, 3 Rays. So now you are an 8 stacked team instead of a 9 stacked team. This is one way of looking at it. I'm going to look at it the other way as well. If we just take the drafted bucket that you're in and apply that weekly, what happens? I think it'll be similar, but I don't know for sure. What this showed me is that we can plan for one thing in our draft, and very rarely is that what actually happens when it comes down the line. And it was one further point of evidence to me that we are this balanced approach where you're kind of building up surplus value at each position and trying to make yourself anti-fragile, where your team isn't sunk by one injury in one position. And I think we've kind of seen with like being in this 6 or 7 at each position bucket, that's kind of like the right range. Similar idea here. So many teams lost hitters to injury that it shifted, some of these distributions to the left. So that's kind of why the percentages are different, big picture, but overall it's roughly the same shape. You have your curve, it's still spread, but it's a little bit closer to 0 than the last one was.
But in this case, the numbers, that 2% is now 3.6% on the top end of the advance rate, and there's a higher correlation, or not correlation. There's a higher advantage to the stacking number as you go up than it was, despite following a pretty similar trajectory
Yeah, so this was kind of exactly what I was trying to figure out. When we compare a season long amount to a week long amount, is it going to be the same? Is it going to be better to be season? Like, is it going to be more impactful over the course of a season? Is it going to be more impactful over a week? I think, hypothesis that most of us had is that as you kind of shrink the time frame, the variance increases and the number, like the correlation between players on the same team, kind of spikes upward. We know that in daily, stacking is very important. Batters that hit on the same team in the same lineup on the same night are more correlated than two random players. Season long, we found that, in the last graph, that it is helpful to have guys on the same team. And weekly actually fits logically kind of where we guessed, right in the middle. Worse than daily, which does follow, and better than season long. So this was kind of the answer that I wanted to get at, was how does this help your team in the round one of the playoffs, week two of the playoffs, round two, like the finals? Like, I wanted to figure out, can stacking help you or hurt you more over a shorter time span? And what happened last year is that it was more helpful. It both boosted you at the top end and brought you down lower on the zero hitter end. Your variance in the shorter time frame was a lot bigger. It was plus 3.6 and minus 3.1, versus over the course of the season, things were a lot more, steady. It was plus 2.1 at the high end and minus 2.5 at the low end. So this was kind of just taking away the bars. Let's look at these lines and figure it out. And it kind of tells that story. One is higher and lower, and one is closer to the middle. So this was kind of eye-opening for me.
Yeah, and this here is what we were talking about, the comparison between the weekly scoring stacks and the season long scoring stacks. So yeah, we kind of have a similar here's the advanced rate, and then the semis rate. It's again you're getting closer to that 0% advantage, but the weekly scoring is more advantageous than season long, and same thing with finals. Kind of see it all the way along.
Yeah, and these ones here, you can tell that the impact in the finals much smaller. Smaller expectation. The scale is plus 0.4 to minus 0.2. It's a very narrow thing. Just in comparison, you had there was more of an effect that stacking had on your results over the shorter time span. So my takeaway from this is that I would like to be stacking more over the course of the year. And I'm just trying to use it, as a tiebreaker, as a way to make late round picks, as a way to change things up. If I get to a spot where it's, A or B or C, and it's stack, no stack, no stack, it's going to be the stacked guy probably, for me, just to try and latch on to some of this built-in structural advantage to drafting this way, I think.
I was just going to follow up by asking you, Chris, because I definitely in some early drafts this year was not, really paying attention to stacking. I was so focused on that structure, and there's been so much talk this year about, outfield is just as thin as ever. So you got to secure those outfielders. And then there's been some, analysis done about, possibly fading early round pitchers. And so I've been so focused on those two things that early on I wasn't stacking. And so what I'm curious to get your opinion on is just, if you could only choose one, if it was that, quote unquote, proper structure and positional distribution throughout your draft, or stacking. I mean, I think I know where you're going to go with it, but I would like the confirmation.
I think it's easier to sync yourself structure wise. And then stacking is the nice addition.
The reason I ask is I do think this graph that, the chart about the ARU line going up is going to get taken as just like, oh, stacking's good. And there are going to be a lot of people with DFS backgrounds or football backgrounds. And I do think I could see people, going too far with it is kind of the point I wanted to ask. And I wanted to just confirm that it's still like structure first, and then, like you said, stacking as a tiebreaker.
Agreed. And the thing that this doesn't consider at all, which maybe it will one day if I have the time, ADP value isn't built into any of this. I would imagine if we split, we've split it right now into two things. We have weekly and we have season long. If we take weekly and season long and we split them into two more things. So let's say we have weekly teams that got ADP value among their players. Like they weren't reaching, they were kind of letting the values fall to them and stacked them, versus teams that were stacking, yes, but they were reaching for those stacks. My guess is that those two lines would also kind of diverge. I think that the ADP value teams that stacked did well, and the no ADP value teams that stacked would do a little bit worse. How much, if you had to divide it up between those two, like what is the actual root cause and what is just the correlation? We're not going to figure out. But I think you are just trying to limit the mistakes that you're making, and I think you just avoid the obvious bad things and let kind of the chips fall where they will after that. So I'm really glad that you asked that and you kind of summed it up. I'm still, structure is my foundation. Stacking is, what's the couch going to look like when I put it in the room? And then maybe the player takes, or like, what color throw pillows are we getting? Like, it's that kind of level of it's a pyramid of sorts that somebody can make that someday and lay out the fundamentals and like how we want to think about this. But I think it fits like nicely in that middle land of like, yeah, I want to know that I'm picking the right amount of players, and I want to know that my upside and whatnot is also, tied into how my teams are doing.
So yeah, so that leads us then into the next graph, where you did actually look at structure and weekly scoring. In this case, the overall roster construction, your pitcher, infield, outfield distribution, and then did the same thing for those bins for the weekly scoring methodology that you talked about before.
So this one was interesting. I was expecting a little bit more variation, like on a weekly basis. I was kind of thinking that we would see similar to the stacking, where it was like, the impact is magnified over a short period of time. The impact of structure was actually minimized a little bit, which is interesting to me. And we're going to talk about this in comparison to the season long stuff in a little bit. But if we just look at this graph, this is like our standard. What are we doing with structure? I think we've talked a bit already about, where do you want to sit roster wise? The worst 4 buckets on here all have one thing in common, and that thing in common is 5 players at a position. I think 5 is no good. I think if you go 5 at any spot, even if it's, maybe you just go outfielder, like 5 outfielders in a row, maybe you can get through. Baseball is just such a long season, and there's so many, like, people get hurt. Like, it just happens. Guys rest, guys get traded, like, just stuff happens. 5, I think, just leaves you too thin. And this reinforced that, where it's like, if you look at start from the bottom up, 5-7-8, 5-8-7, 8-7-5, 7-8-5, like, bad, dead. They were no good last year. They weren't great. In terms of the big bars, it's really not that out of the ordinary from what we already know. 6-7-7, 7-6-7, 7-7-6 dominated, like, what people decided to do. And then they also kind of were more boosted by the weekly stuff. The interesting too, the ones with 8 in them. 8-6-6, I think, did better in this version than it does in the season-long version. And 6-8-6 also was about the same. Those are kind of the most unbalanced, I think, of the most common builds that you're going to see. So it is interesting to see kind of where it's different and where it's not. Matt, do we have the comparison between the season and the weekly for the structure?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. This was interesting to me. So if you think back to the stacking one, our blue line, our weekly advance rate, was the more variable one. It was the one that started lower and it was worse when things were bad, and it was the one that was better when things were good. Here it's flipped. Our season long rates for structure are actually the more variable one of the two. What does that mean? Over the course of the season, structure had a bigger impact on how your team did than over the course of a week, which when I think about it now makes a lot of sense. Structure, I think, is like a long-term winning foundation proposition. You shrink that time frame down to 1 week, your properly built team matters a little bit less than just how well did those guys do that week. So seeing this, I was like, oh shit, that makes sense. Like this is, that tracks. That is how we've all talked about it and thought about it. But not until I kind of wrote it down and figured, where are the lines going, was I able to see like, oh, okay. So on a weekly basis, this makes me, that's why I hesitated when Brendan asked, structure versus stacking, where does your mind go first? This is the reason that I hesitated, because this is a little more, it kind of plays against the stacking piece where it's weekly versus season, but in the other direction.
Okay. I think you said it all. I have no questions on this one. And then the other roster construction piece that you pulled out separately was the amount of pitchers drafted on each team. And again, this is in that weekly scoring. Each week is a different tournament methodology.
Yeah. So for this one, I don't think I did the comparison like season versus weekly, but it's similar. It's like 6 and 7 were very popular and good. 5 and 9 were not popular and dead. And then 8 is kind of the one in the middle where it's like maybe it could, maybe it couldn't. One thing that was interesting for me here is that overall the 8 pitcher bucket was like minus 0.1. It's a little bit negative. If you just narrow it into 866, so they're kind of the most standard build, that was like plus 0.3. So with these graphs, it is important. I'll do like the infielder and the outfielder versions of this too. With pitcher is just the pitcher is the one that I think we think about the most when we think about how many of a pitcher, how many of a position to take. My mind goes to pitcher first. If you are building, 6 pitcher properly, so one of the big kind of groupings, one of the big structures, you probably are at the better end of like this 0.2%. Like you're getting dragged down by the bad 6 pitcher teams. Same thing with 7, same thing with 8. So just important to think about when you're looking at these and trying to draw conclusions. It's 1 year. It's 1 year. It's 25 weeks. It's the same teams, playing the same tournament over and over again. We saw how important, having Braves were, having Ronald Acuna was. Like that stuff matters over a year. This kind of structure, weekly or season-long discussion, I think is something we can revisit next year and the year after that. We can keep adding on to what did we learn this year? What do people do? How do people react? How people react is almost just as important as how well it did last year. We're seeing some of this already with the pitching stuff, like people not taking these early pitchers. And then now the dinger's open and now people are starting to take some more early pitchers and things are starting to shift up a little bit. So being ahead of what other people are thinking and where their heads are going is just another way to use some of this stuff, as opposed to taking it and saying, well, this is the truth. This is what's going to happen this year. It's not. It's just something that happened last year that can inform kind of maybe sort of what we think is going to happen this year. And that's the best way to think about this.
The other thing that I think about when we're talking about these 6, 7, 8, especially sort of builds for pitching, generally the 6 has a different ADP cost of those pitchers that they took, just because the general mindset is if I take too early, I'm going to take only 6 overall. So there's definitely an aspect of that in terms of these buckets, and you're taking maybe a better head of your pitching staff in 6 and 7 than you are in 8. So this kind of even goes further into needing more in depth of draft capital in those buckets too. All right, I think we've hit all of your graphs. Even I know you sent me a couple more that we didn't quite get to tonight, but I think that's a lot to take in. I guess, Brendan, do you have any more questions? I see you stewing over there. You've been thinking a lot and trying to take this in. So do you have any more questions or thoughts before we move on to the close here?
I mean, this macro stuff is, the most important analysis you're going to get if you're, trying to seriously play MLB best ball on Underdog. So it's, I've just, it's been really cool to witness Chris Cook. I think the only question I would have remaining for him is who are the teams to stack this year? If you could give us that,
Yeah,
I didn't see the graph for. I didn't see the graph. Yeah, I didn't see the graph for what teams are going to do well in 2024. So if you could send that over at some point, then that would be great.
I do think we need maybe that's our first piece of merch is the Let Chris Cook shirt.
We'll talk to the back office and see what we can devise with the art department. I kind of want to just take the graph with all the teams, and it's like Atlanta way up and kind of tapers off, and just flip it and flip the colors and say these are the 2024 projections. Houston is the team. Atlanta underperform, and just see like how long that could go before people are like, actually, are we sure that he's pulling things like just out of thin air? So I haven't got to that point yet. There's probably someone out there who can and who will do something like team wise. But that is exactly the way to think about what's next. Is okay, cool. Like we made some pretty graphs with the colors, and we looked at what happened last year. How does that help me predicting what's going to happen this year? And I think we are now going to spend the next 2 months kind of thinking about that piece of the equation. It's like, okay, we understand what happened last year and what went well and what didn't. Tell me what this means for like the upcoming year, and start applying some of the things we're learning. If you're just learning this stuff, memorizing the numbers and whatever, but you're not actually applying it in kind of a meaningful way, then what was the point? So I think that's like the big next step is like, what can we do with this to figure out like how to just stack tiny edges instead of stacking dingers. The other option was just stacking tiny edges, stacking.
Imagine that as a name. There's one very last thing I wanted to say to kind of wrap that up about the Braves, because that's gonna, people are just gonna say, oh, they could be this year's Braves. I looked it up because I wanted to double check, because this is a stat that is so crazy to me, but it doesn't feel like a lot of people know this. The 2023 Braves tied the 1927 Yankees with the highest team WRC plus of all time. Like they were that historically good. And that's a stat, like more people should know that. Like baseball is so bad about marketing that stuff. Like they were literally like the best offense ever. And so
they would have to explain what WRC plus is.
Yeah, that's true. But like,
sir, you're trying to tell me that's not repeatable, and there's not going to be 4 different Braves. So
that's my point.
Year?
There's not going to be a Braves. Like I'm like, people are going to say, oh, the Dodgers could be this year's Braves. Like they're not going to be the Braves. So that's like something else to consider. Just a sobering thought to kind of close that 2023 retrospective on.
Excellent
All right.
point.
Yeah, that is it's a great point. So we move on to the extra innings here. Now we're gonna break your brain even a little bit more. Tonight I have pulled up. This is based on the Enoceris Stuff Plus model. I have pulled up let's see, there's 6 pitchers last year among qualified pitchers that had a stuff plus greater than 110. So this is the top tier. So I'll start. I'll give you their stuff pluses here. So you guys got to start figuring out the top 6 stuff plus pitchers in among qualified starters. So
Strider.
I was literally going to say, Chris, I'll give you the honor of guessing our guy.
All right. So the quick one, or the first one here, you got number 3, Spencer Strider, and he is, the 3-pitch guy. The fastball just lights out in terms of its stuff, and then sort of gets by on the other stuff, and has a good location, so he can get by with that. So yeah, you got that one. That's the easy one.
I am honestly, like, I'm actually doing this. I'm operating under the idea. I'm betting Spencer Strider for Cy Young every single year until he wins. And I've actually done that this year. I did it last year. I'm doing it this year. Like, he is going to win, probably multiple. Like, he is, he has the potential. We've talked about it, like, in terms of drafting Strider early, like, maybe don't go pitcher early, but Strider's the one who could lap the field. So,
we're in lockstep. He's, he's the guy. And if he comes anywhere close to that 186 innings that he is projected for,
this is what he did last year.
This is last year. Wow. Sorry.
Yeah.
If he, that's his, that was what last year was. Even if he does that again and is just a little bit more lucky, and keeps up some of the, other stuff, he has like field lapping potential at a position that we saw last year wasn't a difference maker except for, a handful of guys at the right time. He has that, and I'll be overweight until he, gets me to the finals or ends up in the grave like DeGrom. It's one or the other.
So, you mentioned he has lap the field potential. The guy he's kind of with right now, I think he still rates really well in stuff plus, but I'll guess Garrett Cole for one of these.
Yeah.
I know he didn't have like the crazy strikeout numbers. It's really funny that he won the Cy Young in what was, I'd have to look it up, but it definitely wasn't his best season.
Yeah.
And it might have been like his 3rd best season. So it's almost like more of like a
sickening
lifetime
down year. Yeah.
Yeah. But the strikeouts did come down. Like, he did average a lot, and I think it was on purpose. And I think he's going to be, Verlander or Scherzer, someone who he's going to be 37 and people are going to be like, oh, I don't know. But I think he's like a Hall of Fame caliber ace pitcher who I think is going to age really well. And it's smart for him to take a little bit off to be able to go deep into games.
Yeah. Agreed. The 209 innings just kind of is important too.
The other name that feels like it belongs in this upper tier is Glasnow, but I truly don't remember how much he pitched last year and if he qualified.
I don't know if he qualified. He's not on this list.
Yeah, he did. I think I know one of them because it's dumb that he has a high stuff plus. But is Graham Ashcraft one of them?
No, not Graham Ashcraft.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Oh, maybe he didn't qualify. I thought he might not be
qualified. He could.
Okay. I thought he had one of the highest stuff, and it doesn't make sense because I think it's like all the slider. But I think Corbin Burns is still up there then.
You got number 1.
Wow. I would have guessed Strider was first.
Same.
Corbin Burns, 127. I mean,
close,
it's very close. But I thought that was interesting just based on the sort of narrative around him going to this year and how much he did struggle. He still got 193 innings, and, the pitches were fine. The location is fine. So, figuring out what happened and maybe he can do a reset and actually just be more of the Corbin Burns that we expect. So, yeah. Go ahead.
Do we have the other Cy Young on this list too? Snell on here?
He is not. The other Cy Young is not.
I know he doesn't qualify, but I know that Nick Pivetta had a really high stuff plus. But I know he doesn't qualify. Freddie Peralta?
No.
One brewer is enough brewers.
There was only one brewer. Maybe Brandon Woodruff would have been on here, but alas. I'll give you a hint on one of them here, and reveal...
Kyle Bradish.
Oh, okay. We're not gonna move number 2.
Wow.
So I was
Kyle
gonna
Brandt.
wait. I'm still gonna post this out
Interesting.
at some point, but once I get through a bunch more admin um of my drafts, like enough to where it's a decent sample, I'm gonna post my highest rostered player, and it's so far it's Kyle Bradish.
Yeah, so that was definitely the one when I was looking through stats, or one of the names on here I thought would be the hardest one, and I thought would make this game interesting. Him being number 2, and just look at this slider number, 171, which I mean, plus stats in baseball, if you're not too familiar with it, is basically 100 is the average of the entire league. So of all the sliders, Kyle Bradish's was 71% better, according to this pitching model, which is just a nuts number to think about.
This maybe isn't that interesting for people who don't play Dynasty, but in a Dynasty league, I just traded away Mike Trout for Christian Yelich and Kyle Bradish, and it's a league that really rewards starting pitching. And the only reason I mentioned is because like I wanted Kyle Bradish that badly where I was like willing to give up Trout to kind of break him up into two pieces. And again, it's a league that relied on starting pitching, but I do believe that he is like more likely than not to come close to repeating what he did last year.
Interesting. Definitely a hole for me. I don't know if I have
The other thing about
3%.
Orioles pitchers is when they move that left field wall back, like that is like the best park to pitch in. Whereas historically, you think of the Orioles as, you know, an offensive ballpark and everything. But again, that's something to consider. They should be good so you could get wins. You know, we never talk about wins, but that like matters a lot for pitcher scoring on Underdog. So again, those are just other things to think about.
All right, so going back, I did uncover number 5's location plus. So this is someone we generally think of as having poor location, and maybe is on the trade block, or maybe not. I'll give you that other hint.
Is it Dylan Cease?
There you go.
Well, wild and trade block tracks with Cease. Another guy that I don't think I have any of really.
I'm lukewarm. I wonder if we're going to look back and just be like, you know, Cease is someone you just fade when he's expensive and you buy him when he's cheap type thing. Like once we get like, you know,
Like
a
Snell.
few more years. Yeah. Yeah. Like
Yeah,
Snell, honestly.
exactly.
Yeah. That's why that was a good guess of Snell on this, because it wouldn't surprise me if he showed up in a similar light.
Yeah. So we do have this one. This one's very hard. It's someone who we thought who had frankly had bad results last year. He was drafted pretty early. He did get he got 184 innings, and then was hurt, and he will not be pitching this year. So that's your big set of clues here on this last one.
No, McClanahan didn't pitch that much.
No.
Sandy?
Yep.
He would.
I miss McClanahan. It's sad. Loved clicking his name last year. I just don't get the joy in clicking some of these guys' names like I did for that sweet early round Shane McClanahan. It felt so good for like a month or 2 months. It was great. Yeah, and then all this shit. There's always next year. We'll be back.
Yeah, so I thought this was super interesting because in my mind, Sandy had a terrible season, obviously relative to his previous Cy Young season, but his pitches were still fine or excellent.
Interesting.
I think something, and this is, you know, we were talking so macro tonight, and, you know, I think, you know, where, you know, Chris is, you know, obviously the master of the spreadsheets and everything. And I think something where I can come in to help contribute the closer we get to draft season, or maybe focus a little bit more on like player takes and kind of just like the league wide analysis stuff, is they shortened the pitch clock again. It was only by 2 seconds, but we saw offense go up in a huge way last year, not from homers, but just by teams like actually stringing together hits, like, quote unquote, the way it used to be. And no, it wasn't to the same extent as it was in the 70s and everything, but there were some weird pitching results last year where it was like, okay, this guy looks like he's just getting unlucky, but like it never turned around. And I do think it was really hard for some of these starting pitchers to adapt to the pitch clock and all the new rules and dealing with the running game more often. And maybe that's like so some of these guys who I can't really explain it for, I'm just kind of chalking it up to the new rules. Anyways, last thing on that is that they shortened it by 2 seconds and they got rid of this rule where after a foul ball, you can't stall like the way you used to. And you just add it all up. And I think it's going to be like, I don't think we're going to regress the offensive environment. If anything, I think there's one more level it could go. And that kind of jives with like the what Billy Jones found about waiting on starting pitcher to start a draft. So that's definitely something that I've been thinking about a lot, structurally at least.
Yeah, I am working on a little bit of a rebuttal to.
I know, I like that you are, because I'm getting carried away with it. So I really like that you're doing that.
I'm working on that. We are working on updating the ranks. I know a lot of people have been asking about that. So Chris and I will be in there the rest of this week, updating our ranks and including a bigger player pool. We are subbing out Brendan due to his time commitments. Nez will be taking over Brendan's tab. So you'll still have 3 of us setting our ranks and the averages and stuff. But look for that sometime next week to be fully updated. We have a really special guest set up for next week for the show, which should be exciting. And at some point, Chris will get all this posted on Stacking Dingers in a more text format, but you can view these graphs in a little bit more detail and think through them yourself. So for Brendan and Chris and myself, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.